how to set up your limiters to get the best results out of the tools you already have. A few weeks ago, I started a long quest to find the best, the most perfect limiter on the market, and I did a big shootout. I still didn't share it because I'm still processing how to make this information clear and how to share this in the most elegant way. In the meantime, I thought, well, why not actually covering rules and ways to work? I don't like the term rules, but ways to work with limiters to get the best sound out of the tools you already have. Limiters, before we dive into the session, limiters work in a similar way as compressors. They tame signals that are working downward, so they tame a signal that gets above a certain threshold. The difference with a compressor is that the attack time of a limiter is faster and the ratio is stronger. And most of the compressors have a setting that allows you to dial in some softney, while limiters don't have this feature. Like compressors, some limiters also have a look-ahead feature that helps them work in a more transparent way, but that can also have some other downsides, like becoming a bit more muddy, reducing the impact of some transients. So, because they work like a compressor, they are what we call non-linear processors, and all non-linear processors induce harmonic distortion. They start to squash the signal while adding harmonics. And so this is something you try to avoid at all costs at mastering, because you want the processing to be transparent and you want to retain the clarity, especially in the low end. The big difference between a limiter and a clipper is that the clippers don't have time constants. They don't have attack time, and there is some release that can add some groove, that can add some pump, or on the contrary, that can break the groove of the track, while clippers are just hard on off on a sample based target. A few rules about limiters. Even the best limiters on the market, they can't achieve 10 decibels of gain reduction in a clean way. Usually at mastering, we aim at 2-3 decibels of gain reduction. I would say 4 is a maximum. Some limiters allow you to get up to 6 decibels without too much artifacts, but there will be definitely artifacts, and that will be definitely audible. Now the question is, how audible does these artifacts become? And we're going to see a bit how we can avoid that, because it's always dependent on the audio material. Okay, let's dive into the session where I have a few different limiters. So the first big rule when you are setting up a limiter is to always work with gain matching or with linking. So for example, if you look at Pro L2, we have this feature down below here where we have this 1-to-1 ratio. When we have a smart limiter, this is the constant gain. If you look at Newfangled, you have the match level. Not all limiters have this feature. For example, Limit 1 from LeapWing doesn't have this feature, but it's still there in a hidden way. If I click Shift and I turn up the input, you see that the output is getting turned down. Why is this so important to work at a level match signal? Because you don't want your brain to be fooled by the increase of loudness, and you want to be able to hear at which point does the limiter start to break your sound, at which point is it falling apart, and so how far can you push things in order to retain the sonic imprint of the original material. That's the really first very important thing to do. Once you have done that, the great thing about that is that you can also just turn your plugin on and off and listening how much of the transient and how much of the details in the high end do you have, or did you lose. The game here is to try to actually get as much of gain reduction without squashing the transients, without losing the definition, and without adding too much of harmonics. Another way to achieve this, and not all limiters have this, but I love this feature on the one that have it, is to listen to the delta. Again, in Pro L2 we have this little button that allows you to hear the difference between the processed and the unprocessed signal. So you hear only the artifacts that the limiter is bringing. Likewise, in smart limiter, you have this delta knob. You have it also here in newfangled, but for example, limit 1 doesn't have it, or limitless neither, but there is a way around. This is why I made this little effect track, is as soon as you level match things, so you link the input and the output, it means that the loudness will remain consistent. And so what you can do is actually sum the signal that is going through the limiter with the same signal that you have going through a utility, and you inverse the phase. When you flip the phase, then you sum the two and you have only the difference between the original and the processed signal. And this is very handy to have a focus on what the limiter is really doing. For example, if you start to hear long ducking of the low end, or if you start to hear distortion for a long period of time, if you just hear snappy transient detailed, then most of the time this process will remain transparent. But if you start to hear oh and near low end that is present in the delta signal, or if you start to hear decaying distortion, this is something you want to avoid at all cost. So now, how should you set up things in order to get the most transparent result? For me, this process works in two ways. First thing, just go to the loudest section of your track, set up the limiter, push the threshold or reduce the ceiling, whatever, and listen how far you can bring things down before you lose the impact, before you lose the punch, before you lose the clarity. Then you can start to play around with the attack and the release time. Maybe the pumping is too long. If the release is too short, what's happening is that, for example, if a sound is decaying slowly, as soon as it's getting out of the release phase, it's pumping again, and you start to hear like flickering. And this is also creating another kind of distortion like you would have with amplitude modulation. So this is something you want to avoid. So too short release times will lead to distorted sounds, but too long release times will reduce the loudness because your limiter will still be limiting signal. So you want to find that proper area where the release is short enough to get enough loudness, but long enough to avoid excessive harmonics and excessive distortion. Why do you start with the loudest part? Because this is by default where your limiter will work the most, and so you can pay attention to how it is reacting on the loudest signal, on the loudest part of your track. But that's not it. Why? Because usually the loudest part is also the part where you have the most audio information with medium, and high frequency. And these elements, these sounds in the mix in your track, they can somehow hide the harmonics, that hide the distortion the limiter is inducing. And so my recommendation for proper setup of this is you go to the loudest part, you set it up, you adjust the release until you find something that is working for you, and then you try to look for a part where you have only the kick playing, or just kick and bass, something that is really like stripped down, not so many elements, and elements that are playing down below without a lot of instruments that are playing in the medium and the high area. And you will realize while doing so that sometimes when you come at the beginning of the track, for example, with the kick only playing, that actually your limiter is adding harmonics and that you hear some distortion on the body of the kick or on the bass, which is unwanted. And so then you can adjust on the loudest, on the quietest part. So always compare the quietest and the loudest part, the loudest with everything and the quietest with only low end, in order to listen exactly how far can you push things with your limiter without breaking the track. Sometimes you may want to add a multiband compressor before your limiter, for example, if you have excessive low end, because low end is what's triggering the limiter the most. It sounds that it's decaying for a long time. It's down below, so if it gets distorted, you will hear harmonics folding up until higher frequencies. So this is something you want to avoid at all costs. So paying attention, the low end, maybe some dynamic control before the limiter, and maybe to gain that little extra edge, you can add a clipper at the end if you don't want to use a true peak feature on your limiter. We'll talk about true peak in another video, because not all limiters work the same way when you dial in the true peak. Some have oversampled signal, some have just oversampled detection signal, sidechain signal. So it's really depending. Some have linear filters, linear phase filters afterwards, some not. So the true peak feature is there to avoid getting overs, but it's not working the same way on all limiters. So I will not talk about this in this video. Long story short, use the delta, use the gain matched, check at the loudest part, and check at the part which is the quietest with the most low-end energy without high-end content, in order to be able to fine-tune exactly your limiter to be more transparent and to achieve the highest loudness possible without squashing your signal, without killing all the transients and the dynamic, without losing the punch, and without distorting the low end. I hope it was helpful, and see you soon in another video. Take care. Bye-bye. I hope this was helpful and that it will help push your music to new heights. As usual, if you like this content, feel free to like the video, to subscribe to the channel, and to comment if you want to interact with me.